it's not the technology that's the problem, it's the management of that technology throughout, and getting the right people doing the right things at each point, and not being over ambitious, recognizing that that these things are going to last for a long time. So we have to be more cautious about how we start doing it, and then we can start to look at the productivity gains within this new sphere of working, which we can gradually absorb.
Inefficiencies within the construction industry can be easily spotted at the output stage, on site. A recent study by buildots outlined 4 such inefficiencies. One of those were the areas of a project that were worked on per week, which was only 46% of the total that could be. The weekly output from on-site trades can vary by over 50%. We're making too many return visits to incomplete work, and work is being delivered out of sequence, causing issues later down the line. That's all interesting stuff, with the conclusion being that collaborative working practices, as well as technology, can resolve these ills. But what about the more holistic view of productivity in the industry? Improving productivity on site is one thing, but making a whole industry more efficient is another. And although improvements would benefit everyone, competition and the requirements of companies to grow may stifle this approach. Even the ONS state data on the expenditure, skills, and capital of the construction industry are all suggestive of productivity growth in recent years. Yet our productivity estimates show little, if any, productivity growth in construction in recent decades. So where do we go from here? What is true productivity? How are we defining it? Is technology the catalyst of a more productive, efficient, and collaborative industry as a whole? Or are we just looking at the data wrong? I caught up with Brian Green from Brickonomics to unravel this productivity conundrum. Brian has been a journalist, commentator, and researcher focusing on construction for more than 30 years. He writes and produces reports and consults across a wide range of industry topics for both commercial and non-commercial organizations, including Barber ABI, Reba Journal, CIOB, Bays, and the ONS. Brian, welcome.
Hi, hello.
That was a brief intro to yourself. Have I missed anything?
Not really. I basically float around the industry a bit, writing about stuff and analysing stuff and producing outputs accordingly.
Floating around the industry. I think you do a little bit more than that, but we'll go with floating. What we're talking about today is productivity, which it seems a bit of a bizarre one, because the more you put in, the more you get out, so to speak, and that's it over. But there's one place I want to start, and in doing a bit of research into this, I read something that the ONS published recently, and it kind of got me scratching my head. So I'm going to start with a question, but I just want to read this to you first of all. So they said output per hour worked was 1.6% above pre-pandemic levels. And then they went on to say, driven by a fall in the number of hours worked, 1.2%, with output only marginally increasing by 0.3%. So I'm already gone with what they're trying to say. But the question that I want to start with is, why isn't productivity as simple as more output faster?
Depends what you mean by productivity again. But
Okay.
if you're looking at, say, the numbers, what you're looking at, the numbers, the ONS numbers, they're looking at aggregate data. And within that aggregate data, there are obviously errors one way or another. But more importantly, within construction, there's a massive mix of different things that go on. Each have their own individual, if you like, productivity rate, and it's the aggregate of that. So, for instance, if you're doing civil engineering work, that will tend to increase the productivity of construction overall. If you're doing a lot of, say, repair and maintenance work, perhaps that may reduce the level of productivity, depending on which measure you're using. The point about productivity is, it's about input and output, and it depends what you're talking about. The inputs and outputs are. If you're just looking at it, say from a person per hour perspective, obviously the more technology that you use with that, like machinery, etc., you might get a better output on that measure. So, for instance, that's why, to some extent, explains why you've got greater productivity within the civil engineering sector than you might have within housing repair and maintenance, because you're using bigger bits of kit, etc., etc. So you've got to be a bit cautious with those measures. Put it this way: if you were to look at the similar kinds of data in the US, they've pretty much given up on measuring construction productivity, because it has been declining ever since the 60s. To any normal human being, that seems a bit weird, given the increase in the kinds of things we do. Because what you're trying to do when you're measuring construction output, you're measuring a value, and that value is, how much somebody's prepared to pay for your work. So it's a gross value added, should I say, which is a combination of profit, wages, etc. It's quite complicated, and I think that people get over fixated with productivity measures in that sense, rather than actually looking at productivity overall. They're not meaningless, but it's easy to attribute the wrong meaning to it.
Yeah, I always go by with the look with your eyes kind of scenario. If it gets a bit too complex, and if you go around cities and you count the number of cranes, that's usually a good marker for how vibrant construction is at the moment. I know that's really flippant and very easy, but it does give you a little bit of a marker to see what's going on in the UK.
But again, I think you have to look at what the outputs are, and as I say, the outputs that's partly profitability, that's partly how much wages people earn. So technically speaking, if you increase the wages of individuals working in construction, you would most likely increase the productivity, because basically there would be more value added, because people are charging more for the labor, therefore they're valuing the labor more, therefore there would be higher productivity. And these are real challenges in terms of actually measuring what you want to measure, and by taking meaning from a particular given measure. It doesn't mean to say that they have no meaning, it's just they don't necessarily have the meaning you think they have.
Yeah. If we look at national productivity, or the contribution that construction has to national productivity, it's always said construction's a good barometer to how well we're doing as a country. If we maximize productivity within an industry, construction, does that mean it's increased national productivity and we're on our way up?
Well, clearly, statistically, it helps the figures, but actually, the more important thing about construction is that it is a facilitator for other industries. So if we build the right kind of things that help other industries be more productive, then we're contributing to the national productivity in that kind of way, as opposed to simply trying to contain it within the silo of construction. So for instance, if we just sought to pursue the productivity, raising the productivity of construction as our sole aim, we may well find ourselves doing the wrong things for the wider economy. So it's about looking at it in a broader sense. It's that not having a siloed thinking that a lot of companies recognize. You maximize one thing, not by maximizing each of the individual things, but getting the right balance across all of the various strands of inputs that make up the economy, or in the case of a business, their output.
And I think we all know that the industry is hugely fragmented, and you're comparing apples with pears most of the time, dependent on what sector of construction you're looking at. Is it even possible to evaluate productivity in certain points, because it's always fluctuating, it's always changing, there's always different components to a project, let alone on a national scale? So can we ever say that at this point it's been less or more productive?
I suppose so. As I say, it depends what you're measuring. It depends what you're calling productive. Productivity isn't necessarily the same as usefulness. It's just a measure. And technically, it's the gross value added over the decided input, which is frequently put down as hours worked. The other thing that people have to recognize about construction as well is that the construction bit that we're measuring isn't overall construction. Now here's a conundrum, a statistical conundrum, I suppose, that I think can illustrate the point. If we're looking, a lot of people talk about offsite manufacturing. Now, it is quite possible that offsite manufacturing would increase the productivity of creating that piece of built environment. But what you could find is that the work done in the higher value productive end of it, i.e., say the factory work, ends up going into the manufacturing sector and away from the construction sector. So what you could find is, because productivity is so much higher in manufacturing, but by going down a route of increasing offsite manufacturing, you end up shifting stuff into the manufacturing sector and lowering its productivity, while taking stuff out of construction that is relatively high productivity and reducing the productivity of the construction sector. So you could have a situation where you're reducing the productivity of both the manufacturing and the construction sector, while overall doing something that is more productive. So I think you have to be a bit careful. I mean, for those that are statistically minded, I think that comes into the category of Simpson's paradox.
What we've spoken about so far has been quite statistical,
Yeah.
numbers based, although we haven't dived into the numbers, and I really, really don't want to. Is there an argument that we should be more mindful of simply building the right things?
I think we have to take a slightly more, I think my point is, we have to take a slightly more holistic view of productivity across the piece, rather than, as I say, in silos, and not actually necessarily understanding what those silos are. So I think, so if the aim of the construction is to produce things which, say, bits of infrastructure, etc., which raise the productivity of the rest of the economy generally, then that's a good thing. So even if we're not necessarily being hugely productive in delivering those elements of the infrastructure, if they are producing productivity elsewhere, that's a good thing. We have to look at productivity across the piece. We can quite easily change productivity just doing less productive stuff and more productive stuff, but that doesn't give you a balanced economy.
You mentioned offsite previously, and I'll come on to that in a little bit, because it's an interesting one, with what's been going on with the likes of Ilke Holmes and stuff like that recently. But I want to take you back 9 years, and there was an NBS article that was released in 2014, and it said the tools available to the construction industry are undergoing rapid change, and these will be instrumental in creating productivity gains. Now, that was 9 years ago. Have we seen that tech come through and that productivity gains, or are we still looking for those, and is it still developing, or is it ongoing?
I suggest a lot of things are more productive. It's just that it doesn't necessarily, as we were trying to explain, doesn't necessarily fall into the numbers that we see. I mean, I think that, I just look at things, and I just look at a simple thing like, power tools. I just watch people doing things, and I've been watching people doing things since I was a child, as far as construction is concerned. And they do things so much more productively, so much quicker, so much more effectively, so much more efficiently than they had in the past. Now, these things don't necessarily get measured in the numbers, because for all the reasons I've tried to explain, which are unfortunately a bit complicated. But I think we do see these things. They just don't necessarily turn up in the numbers in the way we expect. They might turn up in better quality. They might turn up in lower cost, which means that the profitability of the construction sector doesn't increase much. Therefore, its value added isn't as big as it might otherwise be. So it's all of those kinds of factors. So I think a lot of these things do raise productivity, but people then expect it to start showing through in the numbers, and they don't necessarily show through straightforward in the economic numbers that we look at, because they're measuring a slightly different thing than we think they are.
Moving back to offsite production and MMC, just very, very lightly, what's your take on that part of the industry from a productive perspective? Because it's a very different way of building things. So should we be looking at that in the future? Should it be kind of a hybrid model and a mixture of on-site and off-site? What's your take on this?
I think we've been moving stuff off-site consistently. I think the trouble is that what we don't want to be doing is going into sort of almost a religiosity about it. What we need to do is to do it properly. And I think there's too much of this is the solution. First and foremost, I am pro the idea of doing more work off-site where it's appropriate. I'm absolutely for that, but I don't think it's the solution to everything. And what bothers me, and what bothered me right at the beginning of this new phase of MMC, etc., was that what would happen is everybody would rush to find some big solution, the silver bullet, the whatever it is that solves construction's problems, and actually trip over and fall over. And then what we would do is we would put back prefabrication as a concept, and I prefer to call it prefabrication. A lot of people don't call it that because it's seen as the historic problems before, but we are now creating our new historic problems. So if you look at Ronan Point effectively was pivotal, I suppose, in one sense, of collapsing the idea of prefabrication, which was the post-war wave. Then you had timber frame housing, and then there was the problems with the World in Action program, the Granada program that showed up failures in that technique, which basically not killed but really reduced a growing trend towards timber frame housing in construction, which frankly I've always been quite pro. Ironically, it's always been a major way in which we've done stuff north of the border in Scotland. I mean, about 90% of homes are built with timber frame there. They don't seem to have the same problems we do here. I mean, it's a complex, because some people don't like the idea of it, but they don't like the idea of it because it's associated with all these problems. So so what we get is this wave of prefabrication is the solution. Then we get rushed to delivery, and then we get failure. And that just puts it back 25 years. There's nothing wrong. I suspect there's little wrong with the technologies. There's more problems with the delivery of that and the urgency with which people want to prove that it works. And I think you have to be careful about these things. To be quite honest, and people I talk to who share a similar view have been skeptical about the pace at which people have been trying to do things. I'm a bit disappointed that the challenges with LNG, now I don't know all the details, but what's interesting with say the LNG situation was, because they've got long money, because they can put a lot of money into it, they should be able to look at the whole process and make sure that all of the process is correct. But the news stories I'm reading now, they may or may not be totally correct, but they suggest the same errors occurred there that occurred back in the day with the timber frame issue, where people weren't storing technical pieces of the structure well enough off-site, that led to mold, etc. And they didn't have the right on-site people. They had underinvested in the right on-site people to be able to deliver things. And this was exactly what happened back in the late 70s, early 80s with timber frame housing. So what we're seeing is, and ironically, the last part of a piece I wrote over a year ago basically said, we will just be recreating the faults of the past if we're not careful. And it was, so in a sense, it was kind of predictable, because it's not the technology that's the problem, it's the management of that technology throughout, and getting the right people doing the right things at each point, and not being over ambitious, recognizing that that these things are going to last for a long time. So we have to be more cautious about how we start doing it, and then we can start to look at the productivity gains within this new sphere of working, which we can gradually absorb, and it sets us on a new path where we can make larger, and we can make real productivity gains latterly. But initially it's going to be more expensive, because it's a change in technology, and that takes time to bed in.
What I find interesting in
saying it was quite predictable.
What I find interesting in talking to people and doing this podcast is that two things really. I try to look at the challenges that the construction or built environment is facing, and if you read back and you look back, a lot of them have been going on since the 80s or since I was born, and they're either ebbing and flowing and going up and going down, skill shortages, that kind of thing. It feels like a very similar thing here, but the one fundamental thing that is through it all seems to be, we've got good technology, but the humans need to catch up with that technology and know and understand it better. And a good the analogy I'm giving here is that there's a phrase in marketing that marketing destroys communication channels. They take the fun out of it and they destroy anything. They destroyed radio, they destroyed TV, they destroyed social media. Um, and I'm not saying humans are destroying anything in construction, but like you just said, it's a case of slowing down, understanding the tech, and using it correctly, rather than just stumbling over ourselves for the payday tomorrow.
Yeah, I think rather than, my view is rather than, it's not just the individuals, it's the institutional frameworks within which these
Okay.
things work, be they the organizations, the business organizations, and the kinds of pressures. People have to understand those kinds of pressures that are on people to do certain things. So you've got this massive factory that you build at great expense, and that's long money, that's money that has to pay off over a large number of years, and then you skimp on something that's absolutely central to the success of it, which is maybe the on-site staff, or maybe storage facilities for things, or making or trying to push things too fast, too quickly, so that you end up with overproduction at the factory, no place to store it, expecting everything to go very sweetly and easily when you've got no track record doing it. I mean, I think these are the kinds of problems that bother me. That people aren't looking ahead enough and thinking long term, and there's too much pressure, I suppose, on individuals to deliver quickly. And I think that may well be it. And I think that those people that ultimately are in charge need to step back a bit and accept that it's going to be a bit tougher to get things through than they might. They need to learn the mistakes. They will make mistakes, and they have to be open to the idea that mistakes will happen. So they need to see things as prototypes. And then gradually from that experience, build experience. You can't just start doing something that's highly complex and expect that you will be able to deliver it brilliantly first time. It's going to go wrong.
Yeah,
It
sure.
is making sure that you're checking to see as few things go wrong as possible, and keep looking very hard at what might go wrong, and not creating a blame culture where somebody thinks, I'll hide that because I'm under pressure.
In doing some further research for this, I looked at a CIOB productivity report from 2016, and one of the recommendations that stood out to me is quite simply, communicate better with policymakers. So, do you feel regulation helps or hinders productivity?
I've got to come clean. I did produce that report, but
Yeah, I thought you did. I didn't like to say
yeah, so obviously I agree with the findings of it. I think regulation is often seen as getting in the way. Often what regulation can do, and good regulation, can mean that it acts as a funnel for people to do similar kinds of things that are all useful, rather than competing in strange and different kind of ways. It allows for and certainly from an industry point of view, everybody doing the right, or as near to the right thing as possible. It cuts out people that are trying to cut the system for short-term gain, that with long-term pain. That's the sort of things regulation do. I don't think businesses mind regulation as much as people think they do. Obviously, bad regulation is really annoying, and the regulators need to listen to all parties on that. But often it provides a neat way of people saying, okay, there's a certainty around this. And what's more, from most businesses, if it's the right kind of regulation, it keeps the cowboys out. And it's the cowboy kind of cutting in at the side that is a massive distraction to a lot of firms, and forces them not to do the thing that they would do otherwise.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And it brings me on to my final point, really. And to summarize, I think it's a neat way to do that, is looking at technology and humans. And in a lot of industries and also construction, we see technology as a solution to a lot of problems, skills, and I'd put improving productivity in that. However, we want to measure it. We won't go back to there. And then you mentioned the kind of cowboy side of it, but are we overlooking people skills as a critical factor to productivity, and looking too much towards technology?
I think there's a danger that people get seduced by technology, and I suspect they also don't understand it as well as they think they do. I mean, I think we just got to be cautious, and we've got to be, as football managers love to say, humble. I think it's really important that that we don't expect too much, and we keep trying and seeing how it works rather than expecting it to work brilliantly because somebody sold us a new widget or whatever. And also recognize that technology changes the way we think or the way we behave in other ways than we might expect. I mean, I think, I came from the media, and you look at the way in which the media has shifted massively. So, I mean, for instance, in a sense, the audience questions have changed. The audiences used to say, "Have you heard?" Now they say, "What do you think?" So what do newspapers do? They stop telling you straight news and they start giving you what you think. It just fundamentally alters the business. And these things happen with technology that they're not immediately obvious, and they just kind of happen. And it's only when we look back that we start to realize how technology not just changes what we think it's there to change, but lots of other things around it, the whole kind of eco structure, if you like, of society can change with different technologies. I mean, the motor car. I mean, one of the things that always amused me when I was studying engineering was, years and years and years back, and following trends, was the notion of generated traffic. So back in the 70s and 80s, everybody says, let's put the M25 or an orbital road round London, and that will cure all our ills as far as car travel is concerned. And then what happens? Everybody complains that it's jam-packed with cars. So, I mean, I think we've got to be humble. We've got to recognize that things will happen that we don't expect, and we should be prepared for those. And we shouldn't dig our heels in and say, well, that shouldn't happen. We just have to accept that it does and find ways to mitigate, and also hopefully look at ways that we can anticipate future problems. That anticipating future problems is probably about the best thing you can do to improve productivity.
Yeah. And to coin a phrase that you used halfway through this chat, there is no magic bullet. There is no singular thing that will help or hinder that. It's a collective of various things that will change our productivity in the future. So Brian, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
I hope some of it made sense, because a lot of these things often don't make sense to me.
No, it's Brian. It's always an absolute pleasure to speak to you, and it's great to know that they don't make sense to you either. And it's your words of wisdom that a lot of the industry hang on. So I'm not quite sure what that says about us all.
Well, be humble, I think.
Absolutely, Brian. Thank you so much.
I just like football. But anyway,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, football reference in there. Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
You take care. Cheers, then. Bye.
Bye.